Yeah, so indeed, thanks for welcoming me to talk about the challenges for transport decarbonisation. As you say, 10 to 15 minutes, it's quite hard to get through, but I'm going to try and give a useful overview to set the context for some of the more detailed discussions later on. And in order to set the context for why I'm going to focus on this year and the 10 years that follow, I just want to briefly set the context with carbon budgets. So we now have this commitment to go to a 78% reduction in CO2 emissions across the economy by 2035. What's important here is not just that the 78% by 2035, but it's that we've got a budget. So if you see the blue area under the graph there, we've got to go from 30 years of almost no progress in transport to cuts of 6 to 10% every year over that period. So we've got this blue budget area that's our constraint. And if we start slowly, if you look at the chart now on the right hand side, if instead of following the grey line, if we start slowly with the red line, then we move from having what are already quite incredible reduction rates in emissions to very quickly needing incredulous reduction rates in emissions, because we've got to stick within this blue budget line. So if we start slowly, then we will fail quickly in terms of our total budget. So that's why I'm going to focus on the actions in the next decade rather than looking too far ahead. This chart is derived from the recent Climate Change Committee's report into setting the sixth carbon budget for the UK. And it shows what they estimate the reductions from different types of transport actions are going to have to be across the period to 2029. So where are our savings in emissions going to come from? The big yellow blob at the bottom, 36%, is electrification of the car fleet. Non-EV vehicle efficiency is 21%, that's on the left-hand side there. Electrification of vans is 10%. And travel demand reduction, which is a mix of mode shift and virtual substitution, is 30% of our emissions reductions. So where are we now, and what are the challenges if you take the Committee on Climate Change's framing to be right? Well, electrification, and there's a session on this, it's certainly not easy to deliver the scale of electrification that's planned, but I think on electrification we can see at least some very positive signals. So the government's phase out, as was mentioned in the introduction, a very strong signal to manufacturers and consumers alike. It will stimulate investment, bring costs down, and accelerate uptake. The technology is already vastly improved and will continue to improve. The costs of batteries has fallen significantly. You can buy EVs now with a range of 250 to 300 miles on top end models. We've got funding announced to continue the expansion of the charge point network, which is still obviously a little bit patchy. And we've still got some subsidy going into additional purchase costs, although at some point we have to wean ourselves off that. The chart on the right shows that new car, EV and plug-in hybrid sales were around 3% in 2019. It was 10% in 2020, although you might have noticed 2020 was a little bit of an unusual year in a number of respects. It's worth keeping an eye on the proportion of vehicles there which are plug-in hybrid though, as only a fraction of those miles are driven in electric. So that's not necessarily electrifying all of our vehicle miles. So I gave that one a tick, but if we turn now to the non-EV part of the fleet in the next decade, where the CCC expects 21% of our emission reductions to come from, this is heading the wrong way. I give it a double cross in my made-up marking scheme. To put the figures in context, 32.9 million cars registered on the road and only 1.1% currently ultra low emission. The lifespan of a car is 14.5 years. So every high or higher emitting car than we were planning to sell is making a dent, not just now, but well into the next decade in terms of our emissions reductions. And whilst new car emissions were falling up to 2016, they've risen by 6% since then. They're now at 122.4 grams per kilometre, and the EU target was set for 95 grams per kilometre by 2021. 38% of new car registrations are SUVs, the average emissions are 13 grams per kilometre higher than medium-sized cars. So we can't just fall for the good news stories of EV sales whilst we're ignoring this, where we're undoing some of the good work that's been done in the EV sector. It is a major component of the next decade's emission reductions. Our VED rates are insufficient to deter consumers, and we're celebrating, and I'll put that in inverted commas, 11 years of consecutive fuel duty freezes, which of course makes people less bothered by the efficiency of the cars that they buy. So let's now turn to the 30% of emissions reductions, which is supposed to come from demand shift. I give this 1 tick and 2 crosses, and that probably summarises just how confused the policy piece is around travel demand. But let's start with the positives, and there aren't that many positives from the pandemic, but it has resulted in a 56% increase in the numbers of people who are walking 3 times a week or more. It's seen rises in leisure cycling, and strategies for people and places in Scotland, gear change and the emergency active travel funds have seen some places really upping their game on road space reallocation for active travel, although it will take years, not months, to create good networks for active travel. The other potential positive is working from home. The chart on the right shows the shifts in the numbers of people working from home partially or all of the time, and we've had a 34% increase in people working 100% of the time at home. Now, the question is how much of this will stick or could stick. We've done some calculations which showed that if those people who drive to work, who are currently working from home, stayed working at home 2 days a week, you'd be broadly equivalent to the school half-term effect. It's part of the answer, it's by no means all of it, but it's a significant prize that we could work towards. But there is not a clear message coming out of government on this. It looks like businesses and individuals will be negotiating what the return looks like in the absence of a plan related to carbon emissions, for example. Now to the negatives. First, we cannot ignore the realities of a decade of bus and rail fares rising above the cost of living, shown on the chart there, while motoring costs fall relative to the cost of living. Again, fuel duty freeze is part of that, as is vehicle efficiency improvements. Looking ahead, the switch to electric cars with greater efficiency and zero fuel duty will exacerbate this. So demand reduction through mode shift in the face of this widening cost differential really isn't realistic in my view, at least not at the scale required or in more than a few places where the bus or train is particularly competitive. So coupled with that, we've got the message around avoiding public transport, which continues today as part of our social distancing response to COVID-19. It's going to be a huge job just building back patronage to pre-pandemic levels, never mind achieving that growth that authorities had been banking on. So where's this 30% going to come from? And then finally is the real picture behind the narrative, and I'm taken by the quote from an interview that we did, which is policy is what you spend your money on, or what you do on the ground, not what you say you would like to do. And so whilst the spending announced in gear change been very welcome, as have the funds that have been committed to bus improvement, the reality is that in real terms, the spend on local transport is only just about above a half of what it was 20 years ago. The block grant has been substituted to some degree by this competition funding, but there is less capital overall and less resource going into local transport. National road spending, by contrast, is increasing, and RIS2 will push that yet further if it goes ahead. So we don't have the headroom for more cars, wider roads, at least not until we're electrified, and maybe then for some time if the rest of our current performance continues in the direction it has done. And then there are all sorts of other decisions which are also undermining travel demand, putting new developments in car-dependent locations, agreeing new terminals and runways at airports. I'm not against any of those things in principle, but I think you can only think about whether you're for them or not if they actually fit within our carbon budgets, and right now they don't make sense. And here's an example to demonstrate just how obvious this becomes once you start to put strategies against budgets. So this is the draft Leeds Transport Strategy, which has recently finished a consultation. It's an ambitious plan. It's the best the city has had in my 20 years here. They want to achieve in a decade 130% increase in bus against the declining trend, 100% increase in rail, 400% increase in cycling from a relatively low base, and that will result in a reduction in car trips by 30%. It boldly wants to be a city where you don't need to own a car. So if you can suspend your disbelief and imagine that actually we will do this in Leeds, then they've calculated this gets them to 43% reduction in CO2 emissions by 2030. They want to be zero by 2030. So that's a 57% gap. So what will enable us to go faster? It's not technology. We can't make the EVs and the battery factories fast enough. And if we did, we wouldn't have enough green electricity to run them off. So the answer has to lie elsewhere. I think the wider point here is important too. If our major cities are planning for 30% car reductions, what does this mean for our investment plans? Scottish Government's planning for a 20% reduction in road vehicle kilometres as part of its climate plan. If this scale of change is necessary to meet our goals, then our spending and policy packages simply have to change, not just a bit, but radically from what we've previously had. So I think it's for the conference today to debate what the priorities are and what change might look like, but I think we do have to think about change. A few thoughts from me are shown on this slide. I'll summarise them briefly, and I'm going to start with an unusual one, which is HGVs, and it's great to see a session on biofuels later. So HGVs are expected by the CCC for almost no reductions in the next decade. There's lots of great work being led by the Zemo partnership on heavy goods vehicle innovations, in the short run doing a lot more with biofuels, particularly for bespoke fleets that go back to base. We can't let the heavy sector wait for the hydrogen versus electric road debate to play out. The vehicle assets are in use for such a long time. There's also great work going on to help businesses make that transition to electric for lighter vans, dealing with depot grid issues, etc. I'm sure the conference will touch on that. Second, I think we have to plan for less car traffic, much less car traffic. That means reprofiling infrastructure spend to major urban renewal. We have to find a way of making public transport quickly part of the solution. And if we can't, we have to rethink how we're going to deliver the savings that we were expecting from that. And we certainly have to max out the positive COVID changes. On the non-electric part of the fleet, we have to address the dash to bigger cars. Given the choices that we face, this seems like an easy one at a practical scale, but it's politically difficult. The other thing we have to do is make better use of the cars we have. Car occupancy of the commute is 1.2. We've got some great companies like Mobility Ways and Tandem who could help deliver different types of solution for the commute. And finally, I gave electrification a tick, but if we really want to go fast and be smart and electric, 96% of our journeys are less than 35 miles in length. So we need to use light electric mobility where it makes sense. The dash to massive EVs with huge ranges bakes in extra costs, extra resource requirements. There are lots of scalable innovations within reach in the light electric sector if we want to go there. Of course, there is a world which looks a bit like business as usual, substituting internal combustion engines for EVs and saying we've done it. That's a unicorn strategy. It doesn't work with the commitments we have to meet. Politically appealing, scientifically flawed. There's a world where we say what mode shift we need to have without altering the underlying structural flaws which have prevented mode shift at scale. Scientifically consistent, practically flawed. So to make the changes we need, this has to be a transition like none we've ever tried to deliver before. We can't do it just through win-win solutions. There are going to be some difficult trade-offs. If it's not uncomfortable, then it probably isn't going far enough or fast enough. Thank you.
Greg, thanks very much indeed, and that's a really good place to start, which is a very big dollop of reality, if you like, and the fact that just by making the 2030 target and bringing down the costs of batteries, it's all going to solve itself, which clearly it isn't. I think that reminding us about the whole area of travel reduction, I think that Leeds example, because in the end of the day, giving local authorities much more power in this area is really important. And that whole issue around public transport, and I agree. I mean, I'm a great public transport user, and I haven't used it for since the beginning of the pandemic lockdown. So some real challenges there. If I could remind delegates just to put their questions in the Q&A area. I have one, Greg, from Yasmin Fox. How would you tackle existing high emission car ownership? So as you were saying, SUVs, all of that sort of problem, particularly with older or lower quality cars perhaps being owned by those with lower incomes, less ability to buy a new car. And this really comes back to this area again of just transition of it's okay for maybe 10% of the population to buy EVs at the moment, but that most of the population is going to be excluded for some time. Any thoughts around that, Greg?
Yeah, I think this is a brilliant question and probably a defining kind of policy question for the next, I guess, 2 to 5 years as we work out what are we going to do to transition from paying through the pump to paying through the plug. How are we going to change our road pricing system? Because if we don't do anything, then the kinds of issues which Yasmin's put there are going to widen over time. So we're going to be left with those people who can't afford to move to electric, shouldering a burden through fuel duty. I mean, I think there are some policies that you can put in place to try and help those groups. I think there are like kind of scrappage schemes which are linked to mobility credits. So we know that scrappage schemes, just paying people to junk their vehicles, are not good value for money. But there are schemes which are being put in place which help you with a transition to having access to car clubs and other mobility as a service type offers. We could certainly consider going down that route. I think we should look at potential for bonus malus type schemes where if people are buying higher emitting vehicles, that we recycle some of the additional funds that could be captured from those and try and use them to help resolve the issues for those who are stuck in older vehicles, for example. And I think we do have to pay attention to what we do with the kind of transition, the second-hand car fleet. We don't talk about that enough, but making sure that the second-hand electric market works and how that works rather than just focusing on the new car market. So Yasmin's question's the whole conference. It's a really, really important question.
Okay, I think we're going to have that problem all the way through this conference, actually. But I mean, one of the things as a parliamentarian we get lobbied on hugely is by the hydrogen lobby, and really sort of working out, and I mean, not just in terms of transport, but in terms of the whole decarbonisation of home heating as well. And I have a question there as well about, I think from Chris, about the, what role should hydrogen play in this, and is it something that we should really get stuck into on a policy basis?
I find the hydrogen debate really difficult. It's not my core area of expertise, but it seems to me that we've got camps rather than clear debate on it. So there are those that think that electrification is going to be the solution in the heavy vehicle end of the market. There are those that say, well, actually, no, hydrogen would be better. I think part of the problem is that although we can decide some of that within the UK, it's still going to require, collaboration internationally. So our preferred solution has to be consistent with the preferred solution on the continent. Otherwise, we won't have a heavy goods vehicle market that works properly. So I think we need to look for areas of application early on where we can test that hydrogen works, what its technical capabilities are. There may well be some important back to base within UK activities that we can push that. I think my feeling is we're not yet at the point where we can put all the eggs in one basket on these technologies. So let's get those demonstrations and trials out there. Costs of electrification have changed so much over the last decade. The same will happen for hydrogen, and so we've got to get those trials out there and see how the technology is developing globally.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's going to have to make up this as well, make up as we go along and actually have those examples. Interesting, though, that you think maybe that that decision is going to be made by maybe Europe rather than us, in that what those technologies are to a degree, in particularly in commercial vehicles. But you, Greg, you mentioned internationally. One of the questions we've got here as well is, what have we learned? What can we learn internationally about what's working on transport decarbonisation, or are we all sort of at the frontier land equally ourselves, or have some other nations got ahead of us so that we can see some examples that we should maybe take notice of?
I think you can take pockets of good practice from different parts of overseas. I mean, you can point to Norway and say, look what they've done with electrification. But then they had a massive purchase tax on vehicles anyway. They don't have a domestic car manufacturing industry, so they've had a very different tradition to taxing vehicle ownership in the first place. So, you know, we can learn a lot about how that works at scale from places like that, but we can't port that policy over to the UK because we just don't start from the same taxation base. I think, again, you know, you can look at places like Copenhagen and Amsterdam for actually how far can you push cycling. You can look to places like Bremen for how far can you push integrated mobility. And the answer to the decarbonisation question, I think, as my presentation showed, is actually we need all of this. So you know, we've got to look everywhere, far and wide, and try and put this together in as ambitious a set of packages as we can.
Okay, thanks. I've had a note here saying that indeed there are already 2 bus fleets currently trialling hydrogen with success. I've certainly read about those. Some other questions here from Ian Jennings. Should we be encouraging people to keep an old ICE car longer, especially those who use their car little, to move straight to electric when more affordable, like myself? And how should we consider embedded carbon in battery production to make sure we're encouraging the right environmental choices? And I suppose that, you know, embedded carbon in the existing ICE fleet, if you're not doing a lot of mileage, maybe it's better for the environment that you keep that and don't cause big manufacturing costs. There are all sorts of trade-offs here, I guess, are there, Greg?
Yeah, it's a very difficult set of messages to get out to the consumer, but you know, if you've got you know, we're talking about 95 grams per kilometre in 2021 as a kind of new car average. You know, I bought a Kia Picanto 7 years ago that was 99 grams per kilometre. It's well below what the average of new car sales is now. So there are some vehicles in the fleet that, you know, they're not doing many miles, they haven't got very high grams per kilometre. You know, let's not be replacing those. I think the question more broadly about you know, embodied emissions, I think that's partly down to how are we going to electrify. So, you know, are we going to just replace all of the cars that we've got now, or are we going to try and take advantage of the kind of shared ownership models? So vehicles are in movement for about 5% of the day. A third of cars don't move at all on any given day. And the most that all of our cars are simultaneously moving is 14% of the cars we own during a peak in the morning are on the move. So actually we can deliver the same mobility with far fewer vehicles if we've developed a more shared kind of ownership and access model, and that would make a big difference to embodied emissions. Now obviously it affects the number of vehicles which are sold, but you also turn the fleet over more quickly because those vehicles are used more intensively. So again, you can pull through some new technologies quicker in that route as well. But you know, we haven't got that. We've got a system that's built around the idea that everyone's just going to own their own car, and I think that has to change.
Okay, Greg, that's great, and I think you've just shown us what the big challenges are. If you were a position of being not necessarily Secretary of State for Transport, but the government czar for climate change, what's the, just in a sentence, what's the biggest message that you would want to put across, or try to change?
Stop planning for the last decade. Start planning for the next decade. You know, our investment plans have got to radically change. £27 billion on a highway investment programme. Put that into urban areas. It's got to look like we mean it. We've got to mean it. We've got to change what we do.
Okay, Greg, thanks very much. That's a brilliant introduction.